Hey, I'm Matt, and this is a review on the Pivot Phoenix with two chains. Not the wrapper, just these two chains. Consumers are often teased by World Cup teams prototyping different bikes, but they don't always get released or put into production. This Pivot Phoenix behind me is an exception to the case. It uses Dave Weagle's DW6 linkage with a mid-high pivot and his patented dual chain drive system. This Phoenix is unlike any other bike that Pivot built before. Traditionally, they used their DW4 link, and that was a fixed front and rear triangle connected with two short links. However, there is a lot more going on in this bike, particularly at the seat stay and chain stay. There's actually a flex stay built into that carbon, as well as the multiple pivots in that compact area down there. The reason that Pivot went with this dual chain drive was to mitigate pedal kickback or chain feedback, whatever you want to call it. Basically, what's going on is this upper portion of the chain is allowed to run more freely without impacting the rest of the suspension kinematics. So you have a small cog and a big cog. They're rotating simultaneously around the same spindle, and that's equal to a 35 tooth chainring. You can obviously change that by changing this chainring here. And then that also gives you a ton more ground clearance too. This is a very small ring. I think this is a 22. Most downhill bikes would have a 34 or a 36, so a lot more ground clearance here as well. In terms of frame features, full carbon frame, straight 56 millimeter head tube, so you can use those aftermarket reach adjust headsets to fine tune the fit. Then you've got internal cable routing, comes down through the down tube, takes a sharp bend up and out down to the cassette, and that's actually still running pretty smooth. Then there are a couple adjustments. Down low, you've got a progression adjustment, linear in the forward, progressive in the rear. Up top on this seat stay pivot, you have a high and low BB mode, and that also changes the head angle by half a degree. Pivot says that these kinematics work with an air shock or a coil shock. I found this to be ultra progressive and preferred the linear setting. We'll get into some of those setup details in a minute. The rest of the frame is really well looked after. You've got fork bumpers integrated into the down tube. You've also got protection on the full underside of that down tube. Then the chainstay is well padded. This is really soft and squishy. There's also enough coverage underneath the seat stay. And in terms of protection for the cranks, well, there's a bash guard on here. There's also a small rubber band that runs around this spider on the cranks, and that just keeps this secondary chain from bouncing against that and making noise. Then you've got this pretty clean looking chain guide, and that just keeps pants, socks, shoelaces from getting tangled in there. Never had any issues during testing. Another addition that isn't on this bike because it was an early production run, Pivot has introduced a mud flap up here, and that's just to keep some of the crud from getting jammed up in that linkage. And finally, the rear hub spacing on this bike is 157. Okay, moving on to geometry. In the Phoenix lineup, there are 4 frame sizes, and those start in the high setting with a 440 reach, then go up to 465, 485, and finally a 520. Pivot uses their S sizing, so you've got S1, 2, 3, 4. All of the bikes use mixed wheels, and they all have the same chainstay length, and that is 440. When the bike gets into sag, it's said to be somewhere around 455. And there is one adjustment, which we pointed out earlier, and that's up here at the seat stay. In the low mode, it's 62.5 for the head angle, in the high 63, and that also raises the BB as well. Getting set up on the Phoenix was fairly straightforward. Everything on the drivetrain was already set up. In terms of sizing, I decided to go with the S2, which has a 465 millimeter reach in the high position. Cut the bars to 780. I ran 20 mils of spacers underneath the stem, and then the fork, pretty familiar with that, went with anywhere from 85 to 87 PSI and 5 volume spacers in there. I asked Pivot for their recommendations on the rear shock setup, and they suggested starting at 30% sag. For my weight, I'm 170 pounds or about 78 kilos. That equated to 215 PSI in the shock, and then for the clickers, I referred to their comprehensive shock setup guide and kind of started there. But I would say I was trending towards more pressure and more compression as I got to know the bike a bit better. Definitely had that backseat ride where the rear end was quite short, the bike's compact, and the BB was pretty low. The head angle was kind of splayed out, and I was looking for a bit more support. So as I rode the bike more and pushed it a bit harder, I ended up going to about 225 PSI, and then a couple more clicks on the low speed compression as well. All right, I'm gonna flip over to the other side of the bike here because we're basically focusing on the back half of this bike. There's obviously a lot going on, but it seems to do everything quite normally. This system really relieves a lot of that friction you have of the small idler on a traditional high pivot, as well as reducing the pedal kickback. So number one, this bike has very low friction in terms of the chain. If you covered it up, I bet it would seem normal. You wouldn't even know that all that extra stuff is going on there. And then two would be just how smoothly this bike rides. It definitely reduces pedal kickback or just chain chatter, chain noise. But then the other benefit to this mid-high pivot design is that it doesn't have that entirely rearward axle path throughout. And what that means is when you're coming off the face of jumps or trying to corner really quickly and you're compressing the bike through all the travel, the rear center kind of stays in this like nice zone and it doesn't change too much, doesn't pitch your weight forward. And that's sort of a drawback to some traditional high pivot designs. So this thing, especially with the rear wheel being a 27.5, it's very snappy, it's very light. It doesn't feel lethargic or glued to the ground in any case whatsoever. So whether you're riding jump tracks or steep techie terrain, this bike really feels alive and sharp. And that's kind of where it shines most, is steep terrain where you want to get behind the bike. This is a nice compact rear end, so it feels really easy to jump, really easy to pick up off the ground. And that's where I found the high setting to be most beneficial for jump tracks. It's really this low position that's reserved for the craziest, most severe extreme tracks like Champery or 1199 in Whistler. This bike is very progressive, but not so much just overall. It's mostly how quickly it moves into the sag range or the mid-stroke, I would say. It's really supple off the top, and in the progressive setting that can kind of make the bike hinge at the head tube. So even with really high pressure, a bit more low speed compression, I didn't really find the balance I was looking for in the super slack setting. And so most of the time I stuck to the high position and the linear setting, and that just kind of gave the bike a bit more support, a bit more balance for average tracks. The other thing that this dual chain drive does really well is just calm the chain down, and that's pedal kickback, chain feedback, whatever you want to call it. The bike is fairly quiet. It's not totally silent, but it is one of the better bikes out there for chain management. So we'll throw it to some GoPro chit chat and give you a reference of what that's like on the trail.
I haven't been down this one in a minute. Some chunk through trails. And this is where this bike rides. Just steep, tight trails, slack, rear end pretty short. It's a mid-high pivot. And that is one thing that really keeps this thing alive. Doesn't feel like a sluggish downhill bike, so I would even say that you could get it into an enduro race if you really wanted to, which is kind of crazy to think. But yeah, generally it's pretty light. This has the dual chain, so it's pretty efficient. Doesn't need an idler, and very, very slack, which makes it good for precarious roads like that. So yeah, even on cruisier trails like Ditch Peg here, this bike feels very light, rear end short, super snappy, and still kind of eats the holes. It's still very much a downhill bike, but definitely playful. So yeah, it could be really fun in the bike park, under a racer. It's a different flavor for sure.
For pricing and specifications, you have two options for complete builds. You have the Pro Saint model here for $88.99 US, and then the Ride GX-DH, which goes for $74.99. Now this one here has Fox factory suspension, DT Swiss wheels, and obviously Shimano Saint components, but that doesn't include the full group boat. You have Praxis aluminum cranks, which are specific to this bike. Topping that off, you have Pivot's own in-house bar and stem, as well as a WTB Pivot collab seat. Looping back to pricing, which model holds the most value? Well, when the Phoenix first dropped, I would have said it was the Ride GXDH. But since then, the pricing has gone up on both models, but more so on the cheaper spec. So now I might give the edge to the Saint Pro build with the Fox factory suspension. And how does the Phoenix compare to other premium downhill bikes out there? Well, another popular option would be the Santa Cruz V10, which is also American, also carbon, also has a bunch of different configurations, but I would say that they ride quite differently. The Phoenix is very short, very compact feeling, much more progressive, much more supple, and the frame is also a bit flexier in terms of the rear end stiffness. Whereas the V10 feels more balanced, it offers more options in terms of sizing, and that goes just down to the frame itself. There is a chainstay length adjustment. You get 3 positions there. You also get 3 high, low, and mid BB/head angle options, as well as the 3 reach options, which you can do on the Phoenix, but you'll need an aftermarket headset to do that. How do they stack up in terms of pricing? Well, neither one is cheap. Both the V10 and the Phoenix are only available in carbon frames, and that puts the pricing north of $8,500. Okay, let's break it down with the pros and cons of the Pivot Phoenix. Pros, I would say that this dual chain system has a lot less friction than any other high pivot system I've tried. And then also talking about the high pivot thing, this bike seems to have that nice breakaway and the rearward axle path that you want at the beginning, but doesn't have any of that weird elongating going on that you have with a traditional high pivot. And then the other thing would be that this is a light and snappy downhill bike. It really rides different to most other downhill bikes that are capable of going this fast or being this stable, and there's just something special about this bike. For the cons, there are only 2 that I can think of, and they're sort of more particular to the rider. But the first one would be this compact rear end. The chainstay starts out at 440 and grows to 455. The big thing here is that it works with the S2 size, but I feel like taller riders are definitely going to want a longer chainstay. There is a heavy weight bias on the rear end of this bike. And that kind of plays into the second one in that the low position is not really that useful. This is like totally reserved for the most extreme tracks, the most extreme conditions. And that also plays on the progressive setting. Basically, this bike has one position that you're going to want to ride it in, and that is the high linear setting. What's the final verdict on the Pivot Phoenix? Well, Pivot obviously put a lot of work into this bike. They really went out on a limb with this wild design. But that's what I love about this, is that it looks wild, but it rides and acts quite normally. It rides intuitively. It's very sharp. It's very alive. And that's where I think it's going to benefit both racers and weekend senders alike. It's comfortable, it's quick, it's witty, but it still has that race character to it where it has high speed stability and that bump beating performance. The bike has been flawless. So yeah, pretty impressed with this bike overall, and I'm curious to see where this dual chain drive can go, maybe onto an enduro bike or something like that in the future. So thanks for checking out Pinkbike and the review on the Pivot Phoenix. You let us know what you think of this bike and if this drivetrain is too wild for you.